Oh my goodness. Wow. Happy freaking Monday, besties. What is going on? Who is here with me? I see you guys here in the chat. Hello to Dr. Deb. What's good? Hey, Anya Zimi. Hello, hello. Hello to Cappy. Is that short for Capricorn? I'm very curious. Capricorn gang. Hey, Samaje. Hey, bestie. Oh my goodness. Hey, y'all. We have lots to cover today, so I'm gonna hop right in. Welcome to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Winter, also known as Mixed Mercury, also known as the Astro Himbo, and welcome to Transit Chat Monday, also known as Mixed Mercury University, where we discuss the overlaps between politics and US history and astrology. And particularly what I've been doing lately is breaking down terminology and buzzwords that we've been using a lot on Twitter, on Instagram, on all these different social medias, to the point where we've watered them down and bastardized them from their meanings. So let's go back and retrieve those words in the actual context that they come from and what they actually mean so that people can stop saying things that are factually incorrect. um, in the spirit of planets being in Aquarius, that includes Saturn, Mercury, and the Sun right now. I've mostly been focusing on language. Also, due to the addition of Mars retrograding in Gemini, yes, been talking about language and words and the ways that people weaponize it against other people, especially people of marginalized identities. The ways that we've seen this happen the most right now is through right wingers and the radical right Nazi party at this point, basically. Use terminology like DEI and wokeness and I don't know, whatever else they're talking about, critical race theory, all of these different ways to basically dog whistle to their base that these things are bad and the people that they benefit are also bad. So, to talk about the transit first in question, as you see here on the title or here on the title, wherever it is on YouTube, our transit of the week and the only significant transit this week, or rather major aspect this week, is Mercury square Jupiter. So Mercury right now, like I said, is in Aquarius. Jupiter is still in Taurus, as it has been for the last year, starting to wrap up its transit. And still in the post-shadow period of its retrograde. We've talked a lot on this channel about the square between Aquarius and Taurus. And I think this transit in particular is significant to me because, again, because of Mars retrograde in Gemini. Gemini is a sign ruled by the planet Mercury. And the relationship between air and earth. So, in short, because I know I've talked about this a lot, in short, air is language, concepts, the imagination. It is how we use language to kind of speak things into existence, more or less. And by existence, I mean speaking it into people's consciousness or into people's awareness. Whenever you talk about things, whenever you communicate ideas and information, it allows people who are hearing those words, that language, that information to come up with an idea of that thing in their minds, which then kind of bursts it into cognitive reality or into perceptual reality or conceptual reality, whatever you want to call it. It becomes an image in your mind, which then makes it real and something that you have to kind of consider and orient around. And whenever we're talking about fixed signs like Aquarius, like Taurus, we're usually talking about identity in some regard. So this particular square is really about how we can use words to bring something into the imaginations of other people. And then Jupiter and Taurus, of course, is our kind of stand-in placement for how culture and society and norms are shaped collectively as like these collective experiences. And how the transit Jupiter and Taurus usually says something about how we are understanding a new context that are, I don't know, that what we consider is normal or normative is changing based on the times, right? Cool. So the square would imply to me something about how language is shaping culture and culture is shaping language. Now, the air part, air imposes itself on Earth. So, in this case, Aquarius is imposing itself on Taurus to say, hey, when you talk about things like this is the impact that it has on certain identities or the impact that it has on society. So, you should talk about them in this particular way, or you should consider, all of the different ways that maybe people can use language to shape society. And then the earth part of Taurus says, well, this thing exists in a material sense, regardless of how you speak about it. So, like, I'm going to resist your desire to impose certain language on me because how I think about a thing and how I understand a thing in the material sense doesn't always align with the words that you're using to describe it. Right. So, you can see how these two things kind of really talks about the square in and of itself, the friction between these two things, and how, in some ways, they can progress each other's ideals or concepts or whatever, but in other ways, they resist each other. So I'm not here to say that one is winning over the other. I'm actually here to talk about the ways that they influence each other. Like I said, the ways that language shapes our society and our culture and the meaning that we give to words based on what is considered normal in culture. So that's our framework. And there are two major topics that I want to talk about. One is, like I said, DEI and just blackness in general. And then I also mainly want to talk about eugenics. So that's going to be the bulk of our conversation for today. So I want to say hello to Heart, who also just joined. Hello. Welcome to the conversation. Welcome to class. Um, Dr. Deb says, I was just chatting on Blue Sky about white people teaching closed practices to other white people like we do. Like, no, Sharon, just because your spirit guide said it was okay doesn't mean it's okay. Listen, don't even get me started. Okay. So I think we've spoken briefly about how, or, colloquially, I'll say, we've spoken about how DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, just as a term, has been bastardized and now reframed or being used in this way that's a pejorative. Same thing with woke. These have been used as pejoratives or as insults to a certain group of people or to the groups of people that it benefits. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is kind of a more modern or today version of affirmative action, which is basically, for all intents and purposes, to say, like, hey, let's diversify our spaces where people work, right? Like, let's have more than just one type of person working, usually one type of person being white men, and the ways that it's mostly benefited white women. But in general, diversity, equity, inclusion, let's just say, to be less discriminatory whenever hiring people, so that if somebody is actually qualified for the job, hire them. Don't be racist. Don't be sexist. Don't be ableist. Don't be, homophobic, transphobic, whatever. If the person can do the job, hire the person to do the job. Um, so the way that the right has been using this in conversation has been to basically, like, use it as the new N-word. And so the video that I'm referencing today by Garrison Hayes, who is a black content creator on YouTube. If you want to watch this video yourself and take your own notes, draw your own conclusions, the video that I'm referencing is called DEI and the Rise of the Modern Slur. I thought this was a perfect entry into this Mercury square Jupiter thing that we're talking about, as well as how it kind of incorporates these Pisces transits, which are ruled by Jupiter and Taurus. Okay, big brain stuff today. Woohoo. So he opens the video by talking about what is a modern slur. Modern slurs are basically certain terms that are being weaponized against Black people. This video, of course, being more specific to Black people, and then we'll see later how this is actually about a lot of different types of people, but a lot of stuff, especially in the US, stems from racism specifically. So that's why we're starting with slurs in this particular way. So we're talking about terms being weaponized against Black people. Obviously, the N-word is like the slur of all slurs, right? And there's the reason why the N-word is so powerful, despite its history of deriving from the Spanish word negro, which just means black. It's literally just a descriptor, not meant to be an insult. It was eventually repurposed to be a slur. That was the whole point. It was meant to be a description for people with darker skin And then by the late 1830s, it intentionally became a well-known slur that is meant to convey contempt and superiority over Black people or darker skinned people in general. So through the success of the civil rights movement, eventually it meant that it wasn't okay to, behave this way anymore, to just outwardly call people the N-word. um, and so through the civil rights movement of the 1960s in particular, racism basically became unpopular, right? People frowned on it. Kind of ties back to the liberalism conversation that we were having last time, where racism after that point was kind of believed to be something that was like a thing of the past. And you'll hear people say this today, especially like more moderate Republicans of today, and just in general older generations and people who would be like, racism, like that's a thing of the past. We're a lot more inclusive now because of things like desegregation and affirmative action, so on and so forth, right? um but what they don't realize, what a lot of us younger people notice, but older people maybe don't notice, or just people in general maybe don't notice as much, is that racism never left, obviously, but it has been rebranded into something more palatable for each generation. And I like that he used that word palatable because it definitely fits in with this Taurus kind of Venus idea of things being acceptable, being palatable, not making waves, not making people uncomfortable. So it's basically a way of saying over time, racism has become more covert and less on the nose as it used to be, which used to be very, very obviously violent on a day-to-day basis in a way that people couldn't ignore. Today, it's a little bit easier to ignore it, basically, for all intents and purposes of this conversation. So DEI programs, this is where they come in. They are policies and practices that are designed to make environments more fair and welcoming to folks who have historically been included. The critique, of course, especially by people who are not liberals, is that it still upholds the status quo of capitalism and everything else. You wouldn't really need DEI if people had actually hired people based on merit and not things like nepotism or favoritism, but it does still exist to employ skilled professionals who would otherwise be overlooked as a result of biased hiring and recruitment practices, right? So the irony of it, of the way that people have used DEI as a slur today, is that, it used to be common practice that people, especially white people, would just hire other white men who they knew, who had money, who had class, who had status, whatever it was, rather than actually hiring people who were qualified for the position regardless of their identity. But naturally, they've managed to frame it as a handout for Black people, for queer women, or for queer people, for women, for disabled people, for whoever it is, because you know how much the right hates handouts, the idea of handouts, and thus it has become a modern slur. So modern slurs serve two purposes. The first purpose is plausible deniability, to bigots specifically, or to people who want to be racist and who want to be discriminatory in their practices, whatever it is. The N word is like, again, an explicit hard line, especially in the media, to where if you say it, then you're automatically like, they're automatically going to say you're being bigoted because only bigots use that word, right? But modern slurs are a way to invoke the power of the N word without actually saying the N word. It's a dog whistle, right? um it it's it provides just enough clarity to particular groups who are hearing it as a slur, who are using it as a slur, to still say what they need to say, to still do the insulting and the subjugating, but without explicitly being bigoted. So it provides just enough plausive deniability that bigotry is up for debate, right? So, well, he didn't say the N word. That's not how they're using it, but it's like within the context of all that came before us, right? It's a slur. So, Dog Whistle Politics was actually a book. I forget the guy who wrote it, but he mentions it in this video. Dog Whistle Politics is actually something that came up during the Reagan era, which we've talked about how the Reagan era is very similar to the current administration. The Reagan era employed this imagery of welfare queens, which conjures up racial images of Black women basically abusing the system and therefore makes taxpayers, those who pay into the system, become people who are being abused by the system, white people being abused by the system, or then can draw the conclusion white people being abused or taken advantage of by this idea of the black welfare queen. See how insidious that is? It's like that's not actually a thing, but because they use the example of one woman who took advantage of the system, who I don't even think she was black, or maybe she was, or she was Hispanic or something. She wasn't white, but it was a one instance of a woman who was taking advantage of the system, and then they generalized that onto a whole class and race of people, basically. So anytime you hear the word welfare queen, the idea, the image conjured up into your mind is a black woman taking advantage of the system and thus harming white taxpayers. Okay. So that's kind of what we mean by plausible deniability. You can say welfare queen instead of saying the N word, right? You can say DEI again instead of the N word, woke instead of the N word, CRT, things like that. So the second reason for a modern slur is normalization, which goes back to this whole Jupiter and Taurus thing of normalizing things into the culture, and recontextualizing it for the current times. It's designed to trick well-meaning moderates or centrist people politically into participating in bigotry, right? So again, DEI, CRT, woke, all being used as pejoratives. So anytime that you say it, regardless of how you mean um, it seeps into your subconscious that it's bad to be associated with these words, even if that's not the original meaning or intention of those words. So it normalizes the phrasing of that term, even if you're being tongue in cheek about it. Many of us have made jokes, especially on socials, and memed about like being woke and DEI, all of that kind of stuff. But ultimately, it's just reinforcing the normalization of using these words in the pejorative sense. Same way that slavery was swapped for the term criminal, with the amendment of the 13th amendment in the Constitution. Oh my gosh, words. So in the same way, when slavery was no longer fashionable, palatable, something that people were comfortable with, it then gets rebranded into this more colorblind justice system vibes, where prison, basically, slavery can be used as a punishment for doing crime, and therefore criminalizing black people in the process. So same thing. Criminal, usually something associated with blackness or the black identity, because of the ways that the 13th amendment still allows for slavery and thus criminalization of black people. Jim Crow terrorism was also rebranded into the war on crime, also rebranded into gerrymandering. So more words that whenever you hear them used, especially in right-wing media, is a dog whistle for black people, disenfranchising black people, or criminalizing black people. So today, again, these words are being used to train a new generation, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, even some baby millennials, into devaluing the contributions and presence of Black people specifically and other marginalized groups more broadly. It's meant to overturn and reduce all of the work that was done during the civil rights era, especially. And to end the video, he says the solution is to only use these terms associated with their literal meaning in order to disrupt the way bigots are using these words, and to quit normalizing um, using these terms in this way. So this framing, I feel, is important, mostly because it shows the way that language evolves over time, to do some of the same things that it's done historically, which is to erase, to berate, um, to dismiss certain identities, to disenfranchise certain people, and to still be bigoted, to still be oppressive towards certain groups through the ways that we talk about things. Because one of the reasons why language is so important, and why these discourses that we're constantly having on social media, why it's so important, is because the way that you speak about things shapes public consciousness, right? Like, it's not just sticks and stones may break my bones, right? Like, language is meant to shape public consciousness around certain ideas and certain groups of people. And so the more that you let shit slide and kind of fly under the radar as like, well, it's not that big of a deal, the more it continues to recirculate, and it continues to shape the way that we treat each other and the way that we talk to each other, right? So that's kind of my intro into then eugenics, because what I've learned and what I've realized when you actually research the shit is that, you know, so much of racism, eugenics is the vehicle that basically carries racism into all of our institutions, into all of our conversations, just into our consciousness. And so, something a lot of people have mentioned, and by the way, talking about eugenics, because eugenics is a word that a lot of us have now spoken about or tried to speak to more, eugenics and ableism, because of COVID, right? In recent years. And I think it's been one of those things where people are using it appropriately. A lot of people are using it appropriately, but then because other people don't understand really the full like context of eugenics and what it actually means beyond just like Nazi concentration camps. A lot of people don't understand like what we actually mean when we're talking about something being ableist, and therefore people hear people talking about ableist and they're like, the left has become too woke, too puritanical, too this and that, and now everything is ableist. You can't do anything, and it's like, well, similar to the ways that everything is racist because everything is actually racist, a lot of things are also ableist. Like it's one of those things we're all going to have to get I don't want to say comfortable, but we need to understand just how broadly these things actually do apply whenever it comes to the foundations of, for us, America, because we're Americans, but also Europe being a big place too. So a lot of people have spoken about how it's not historically accurate to say that, the Nazis and Hitlerian Germany, um, are the first people to do eugenics, because in fact Hitler and Nazi Germany are referencing US practices and also other older European practices whenever they do eugenics. Like they got their ideas from the US. This was something that I actually did not know. So I looked into it. I watched a few videos. One of them is The Dark Side of Science, The Horror of Eugenics Theory, which is a short documentary by Plainly Difficult on YouTube. And then I also watched How Britain and America Inspired Nazi Eugenics by Radical History. So if you want to search those things, the titles are very plain and direct. And what I realized, or what I've learned, is what I'm going to share with you here that actually blew my mind. I was gasping constantly whenever I found out some of the influences of modern day eugenics. So let's get into it. Both of these videos, they're pretty much the same thing. Some give more details than others. You can also learn more about the OG of eugenics, Sir Francis Galton. So, fun fact about Sir Francis Galton is that he himself was considered like a child prodigy, but a very poor student. So he didn't actually excel in the institution of academia, despite, being what sounds like a gifted kid. So Sir Francis Galton himself was possibly neurodivergent himself, and yet is the father of eugenics. So that's kind of ironic, right? Anyway, um, so Sir Francis Galton, he is a British scientist influenced by his cousin, Charles Darwin. How about that? Influenced by his cousin, Charles Darwin, who wrote the book, who a lot of eugenicists quote, The Origin of Species. So I did study a little bit of evolutionary psychology when I was in school. I do remember hearing a little bit about this, as well as anybody who's taken a biology class knows of Charles Darwin and some of his work. But naturally, these people took it to the next level and applied it to humans instead of just pea plants. Is that right? Was that Darwin? Not Darwin. I'm thinking of the other guy who did pea plants. That other scientist. Can't remember his name. But good morning, April. Yes, Charles Darwin was his cousin. So the first chapter of The Origin of Species talks about the variation of domestication, which explains how different breeds within a species are often produced from a common ancestor by process of selective breeding. So this is basically just like, the way that dogs are bred to do certain jobs, or certain species are bred to produce certain produce certain outcomes, right? A quote favorable outcome. People were doing this with plants, with crops, with animals. They've been doing things like that throughout history, which is a lot of what Darwin was talking about. And so Francis Galton was the first to apply these ideas to humans with the intention of, quote, giving the more suitable races of blood a better chance of prevailing over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. So basically, breeding people with favorable traits, so that they produce more people with favorable traits, specifically having to do with race and class, which we'll find out later. He named this practice eugenics in 1833 and defined it as a science of improving stock. We'll talk about this a little bit later too, but he forms the Eugenics Education Society, which has been renamed to the Galton Institute in 1989, and then later was renamed again to the Adelphi Genetics Forum in 2021. So, you know, it's still more or less around. Gregor Mendel, yes, thank you. That's what I was thinking of. Gregor Mendel also kind of Gregor Mendel did a separate thing. He was the one with the pea plants. Yes, thank you. I was like, I know this had to do with genetics, but it wasn't Darwin. But those two often get conflated, I think is what I was trying to say. So thank you for that. Yes, evolutionary psychology is a scam. It was an interesting class. Very controversial class. Wrote a lot of papers that I was like, yeah, I don't know about all that. But evolutionary neuroscience, yes. Evolutionary biology, yes. Those things are interesting. Yes, Gregor Mendel is the Punnett Square dude, I'm pretty sure. But Charles Darwin is the guy that a lot of people associate with survival of the fittest, when that, not, there's more to talk about that, but we're not talking about Charles Darwin today. We're talking about Francis Galton today, because we're being more specific about eugenics, which is not necessarily what Charles Darwin was talking about. He was talking about something else. So, with the rise of eugenics, Britain was looking for ways to improve the population to make it a stronger, healthier, more productive nation. And those words are important. Stronger, healthier, more productive nation. Those words are important because all of those words become dog whistles whenever we're talking about eugenics, right? And this whole thing of weaponizing language. Eugenics was seen as a panacea to make the population better, and they believed that it would solve problems like crime, poverty, and mental illness. Remember, we just talked about how crime and criminal is associated with blackness, right, during this time period. So people like William Beveridge, who was a liberal reformer and architect of the welfare state, along with economist John Maynard Keynes, the Keynesian economics guy. He was a key thinker of liberal economics, he was a key thinker of liberal economics. Both of these guys, William Beveridge and John Maynard Keynes, supported eugenics. So remember, this is why it was important for us to break down what liberalism actually was, because of shit like this. So other liberals and even progressives supported ideas like forced sterilization to eradicate negative traits from the population, like mental disability and other abstract characteristics like laziness, criminality, which they believed were inherited. So rather, this brings up the whole like nature versus nurture arguments and things like that. A lot of these people believe that was nature, that believe that things like poverty and criminal activity and things like that were genetically passed on. So they championed things like forced sterilization so that these people couldn't reproduce. So, a really famous champion of eugenics, and we're talking about in Europe right now, again, bringing back the Eugenics Education Society in 1907 in London, they believed that poverty was rooted in the genetic deficiency of the working classes and that the feeble-minded should be prevented from having children. So whenever people say poor people shouldn't reproduce or poor people shouldn't have kids because they can't afford it, blah, 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 this is why people say that that's eugenics talking points, because quite literally they said working class people and the feeble-minded shouldn't have children. Someone who was really into this was Winston Churchill, who in 1910 became the VP of the Eugenics Education Society, and he warned about the multiplication of the unfit as something that posed a danger to the Anglo-Saxon race. He went on to propose forced sterilization and blocking marriages between those judged mentally unfit. He also planned labor colonies to where the criminally feeble-minded could be detained, just like somebody else we know. I just saw someone in the chat say this. And then long before Hitler, Churchill was also using language that would later be used to describe those who, quote, failed to live up to the standards of the master race. So a lot of that stuff wasn't even Hitler, right? A lot of this stuff happened long before Hitler. And another fun fact about this time period, about 1905 to 1907, 08-ish, guess what the sky was doing? I looked it up. Saturn was in Aquarius. And not only was Saturn in Aquarius, but I believe 1905, either 1905 or 1906, Jupiter was also in Taurus while Saturn was in Aquarius. What are the odds? What are the odds? Which means that during that time and also during the 60s, because I also checked, the Saturn in Aquarius while Jupiter was also in Taurus, Gemini, and Cancer. Just like here, just like right now, Jupiter making the same path at the same time that Saturn is making the same path. So these things are all tied together a lot more astrologically than I thought. And then you can also add in that the peak of Nazi Germany, Saturn was also in Aquarius, and I want to say Jupiter was also in, well, let me not say because I don't fully remember, but I think Jupiter was also close by in Pisces or Aries or Taurus. I don't know. I'll have to double check on the Jupiter placement during Nazi Germany, but Saturn was in Aquarius during all of these time periods. So whenever we're talking about weaponizing language and how that leads to the erasure of whole identities and populations, like, hello, wild. I was shook. I was like, I did not know. I never would have guessed, but I would have guessed because I looked it up and figured that's what we would see. So cool. So okay, so that's on Churchill. So this is where we start getting into eugenics policies in the US. So back to this date of 1906, Saturn was in Aquarius, Jupiter was either in Taurus or Gemini at the time. A man by the name of J.H. Kellogg, yes, Kellogg cereals, Kellogg brand, J.H. Kellogg, founded the Race Betterment Foundation. So yeah, Mr. Kellogg's cereal was also involved in eugenics in the US. And then there was also a guy named Charles Davenport. These all things kind of overlap, so bear with me. But in 1911, Charles Davenport founded the Eugenics Record Office in New York. Okay, and so both of these guys believed that eugenics could alleviate the economic burden caused by certain undesirable members of society, especially the disabled and the mentally ill. And this is in the US. Both of these foundations were backed, or these ideas, I should say, eugenics ideas were backed by huge banks and corporations like Carnegie Mellon and Rockefeller Foundations. Wow. Campaigns, these campaigns that were run by the banks and by these foundations, they were through conferences, they were through advertisements, like literal flyers talking about marriage and things like that, and advertisements, research journals, all these types of things, until Indiana, the state of Indiana, passed the first compulsory sterilization law in the world. The first compulsory sterilization law in the world in Indiana in 1907. So these were widely supported for decades. And when I say decades, I mean between 1907 and 1963, beginning of the civil rights era, over 65,000 people in the US were sterilized against their will, and had a disproportionate, this is the kicker, a disproportionate amount of these people were Black, Hispanic, and Native American women. Hello? 65,000 people! Did he have an issue with menstruation or something like that? That I don't know. Maybe he did. I do know something about Planned Parenthood is wrapped up in all of this, but I didn't go down that rabbit hole. So if you would like to go down that rabbit hole, go for it, because I'm sure it all ties back to women's rights and things like that as well. So not on the topic today, but I'm sure wrapped up in all of this as well, and probably a fascinating thing to look into. So Yeah, forced sterilization, bringing those two categories together. And then in 1911, the Carnegie Report explored 18 different methods for removing defective genetic attributes, and euthanasia was number 8. Right? So they have explicit documentation that says straight up to euthanize people with certain genetic defects and attributes and things like that. And then there was a textbook called Applied Eugenics by Paul Propano of the American Eugenics Society, who argued that execution was the standard practice to maintain the gene pool. So this is years before Nazi Germany, okay? And then you get to Mein Kampf in 1925, where Hitler lavished praise of the US application of eugenics. Like that man is looking at the US and he's like, wow, I want to do that. He says he studied with great interest. This is like a direct Hitler quote, studied with great interest the laws of several American states concerning prevention of reproduction by people whose progeny would be of no value or be injurious to the racial stock. Hello? He particularly admired an American lawyer by the name of Madison Grant. So in 1916, Madison Grant published a book called The Passing of the Great Race, where he lamented the pollution of the Nordic race by other inferior races in the US. And he was a lot less coy about his racism at the time, where the solution was to purify the American race through immigration restriction, selective breeding, and sterilization. Where have we heard that before? Sounds awfully familiar to some things that some people are doing today. The first non-German book. This book written by Madison Grant was the first non-German book to be reprinted by the Nazis when they took power, and Hitler called it his Bible. He called it his Bible. Another one, this one gagged me, was that Hitler also admired Henry Ford. Yes, of Ford Motors. He admired Henry Ford and the Motor Company, because Henry Ford had a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent in 1920 that would publish articles on, quote, the Jewish question, spouting anti-Semitism about Jews running the world, controlling the media, and starting wars for their own profit. So that was Henry Ford, and it led to a publication by Ford called The International Jew that was also employed by the Nazis. So these are like major books and learnings that the Nazis used to carry out all of their horrible deeds. All stuff that started in the US. So it's like not even just chattel slavery, but like then you add in all of this stuff that was really later used by US slaveholders to justify slavery. So it's not even like what they thought at the time that they had slaves. They were just being terrible humans and committing crimes of humanity, and then later get into things or created things like race science and eugenics and things like that to justify their horrible crimes and say, well, we had to do this because you see where these are the inferior races of people, and we didn't need to we didn't want to let these people take over. We did all of this for good reason. We didn't want to pollute the Anglo-Saxon race, the Nordic race, whatever it is, whiteness, with dark-skinned people who we've decided are inferior and have subjugated to terrible living conditions. So yeah, I didn't know that Kellogg and Ford had a direct hand in a lot of the eugenics campaigns that were happening in the US. And then Hitler was like, oh, you guys might be onto something, and then picked it up himself to commit crimes against humanity against the Jews. But then again, also, this is why when people are saying like it wasn't just like the Jews. They started with anybody that they deemed mentally unfit. And the thing about it was that what was considered unfit was really just determined by the state. There wasn't even like a specific like identity that was mentally unfit. It was anybody that the state decided was unfit. right? So that's why these terms, whenever people are talking about being fit and strong and healthy and working out to avoid their humiliating death from fascists, if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. That's why those are eugenics talking points, basically. And the history of, of statements like that, like, goes way back. Um, why fitness as a concept is eugenics, right? This is also why, if you want to go down another fantastic rabbit hole, there's a book that I read a couple years ago called Conspirituality, and it talks about how spiritual practices like yoga and some other spiritual practices and the idea of purity and wellness and stuff like that all is also rooted in eugenics in other cultures as well. Look into that, because that, obviously, me coming from yoga, from being a yoga teacher and learning yoga and things like that, yeah, big long history and a lot of associations with eugenics in that branch. If you want to look into it, they also have a podcast that talks about more modern conspirituality stuff, like RFK, before this administration. They've been talking about it for a few years. So that's another great book that I definitely recommend looking into. And also another reason why these kind of wellness almond mom cults slip into the far right, alt-right pipeline so easily. So there's that. So people who were opponents of eugenics, there were some, and by the way, eugenics was like very popular in the US too. It was like, I think 60 to 70% of people like supported these ideas of forced sterilization and things like that. They were like, they supported it. They were into it. They were like, yeah, we should do that, because we don't want more criminals. We don't want more poor people. We don't want more mentally ill people reproducing. So castrate them, sterilize them, put them in the institution, put them in camps, put them somewhere else so that they can't reproduce. That's like their whole thing back then. So there's a guy, Franz Boas, who argued that our social and cultural environments play a more significant role in shaping identity than anything in our DNA. So this is back into the nature versus nurture argument, advocating more for nurture, society, culture, and the ways that our environments shape our identities more so than just anything purely DNA and genetics. And then there's also G.K. Chesterton, who is an English author, who argued that the institutionalization of mentally unfit people sought to prevent anyone that the state thought was unintelligent from reproducing, and argued that anyone could be accused of being mentally unfit. So there were people who tried to speak the good word and say, like, hey, cut that shit out. So then the last part of the video talks about post-war memory lapse, which is basically how all of this shit gets erased from education, because support for eugenics declined in the 1940s once news got out about Auschwitz. So it was only once basically everybody could project all of their bigotry and eugenics ideals onto, well, I guess it's not a projection if they were actually doing it, but instead of acknowledging their own ways that they advocated for eugenics, they were able to say, oh, Germany's doing a bad thing. Hitler's doing this bad thing that none of the rest of us supported. None of us think that's a good idea. That's terrible what they're doing to the Jews. I can't believe somebody would do that. It declined once news got out about Auschwitz, firsthand accounts and things like that spread in the news, and then was then followed by a rewriting of history that erased the role of the UK and the US in the development of eugenics. So that erasure thing that we've been talking about with Aquarius transits and just Aquarius as a sign also serves the purpose of making certain people look better than they actually were in history. Many eugenics societies changed their names and entered other fields of scientific research. History books in schools never mentioned it, but the policies continued to be carried out in the US as recent as 2011. A report from The Guardian revealed that 148 female prisoners in California prisons were sterilized without informed consent between 2006 and 2011. So that shit's still going on. And then the Chief Nuremberg trials, Chief Nuremberg trials prosecutor Robert Jackson, who was a U.S. Prosecutor, was quoted acknowledging that the U.S. and Britain have done or are doing some of the very things that we are prosecuting the Germans for. So yeah. Eek. So yeah, all of that to say, um, eugenics, this idea that basically only certain groups of people should be allowed to reproduce because we want to promote certain good genes and qualities and characteristics of people, and we want to reduce the prevalence of quote bad characteristics, qualities, things like that in society. A lot of that, even though it started with this Sir Francis Galton guy, even though he was a British scientist, a lot of his ideas really didn't take off in Britain at the time that he was coming out with these ideas, but in the US, hell yeah, they were like, let's go, let's do this. We're already doing a bunch of other fucked up shit, so let's just do this too. Let's add it. Let's add it to the list, and thus leads to certain attitudes people have about Black people, about Hispanic people, Native American people, and then various disabilities and mental illnesses as well. The stigmatization of these identities and the desire to erase these people, if not from visibility, at the very least from society altogether through literal extermination. That, my friends, is the power of language, and the power and the ways that the normalization of certain attitudes and concepts and ideas um, turns into policy. We're seeing it happen right now. Of course, the whole reason we're talking about this is because the current administration is literally bringing this shit back full force through whenever they're talking about things like getting rid of DEI, getting rid of woke ideology, and not teaching critical race theory in schools because they don't want white children to feel bad about being white. Whenever I ain't even gonna get into it. So, um, so some of the things that have happened recently to speak to this transit happening in real time is that RFK just got confirmed into the White House as, I forget what his exact position is, but it has to do with basically like health and wellness in the US. And he has already released a statement, or an executive order rather, that I don't want to get this wrong. What did he do? It has to do with psychiatric medications and things like that. Um, 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 Let me pull it up. Okay. This is through his whole Make America Healthy Again thing, which eugenics. The White House issues an executive order to establish a Make America Healthy Again commission, and da, 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 da. The executive order begins by stating that American life expectancy lags behind that of other developed countries with chronic and mental health conditions on the rise. The executive order explains that the United States experiences high rates of cancer, asthma, autism spectrum disorders, autoimmune diseases, and obesity in adults and children, that this trend poses significant threats to national health, economy, and security, necessitating urgent action. To address this growing health crisis in America, the executive order states that the nation must redirect its focus in the public and private sectors towards understanding dramatically lowering chronic disease rates and ending childhood chronic disease. So, on its face, sounds like, oh, okay, so they want to lower chronic disease rates and end childhood chronic disease. Maybe that's a good thing, right? We don't want people to be sick based on these terrible corporations and their seed oils, right? And their red food dyes and shit like that. Their vaccines, right? These are things that they're saying on the other side of saying this. Um what else does this say? Yikes. So it says that it shall be the federal government's policy to combat aggressively the critical health challenges facing Americans, under which policy the government will promote transparency and open source data and eliminate conflicts of interest in federally funded health research. So the National Institutes of Health and other funded research will prioritize gold standard research on the root causes of why Americans are getting sick and agencies will ensure that there are expanding treatment options and insurance coverage to support lifestyle changes and disease prevention. And so going on to say, I'm trying to find the part where he says, da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. They want to start with the American diet, absorption of toxic material, medical treatments, lifestyle, environmental factors, government policies, food production techniques, electromagnetic radiation, and corporate influence or cronyism, using transparent and clear facts, and providing government-wide recommendations on policies to address the contributing causes. The assessment. Within 100 days of the executive order directs the Maha Commission to submit to the president a Make Our Children Healthy Again assessment that will, among other things, identify and describe childhood chronic disease in America compared to other countries, and it will assess the potential overutilization of medications, certain food ingredients, chemicals, and the prevalence of and threat posed by the prescription of serotonin reuptake inhibitors, so SSRIs, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, stimulants, and weight loss drugs to identify best practices for preventing childhood health issues, including proper nutrition. They will eliminate undue industry influence on science, establish a framework for transparency and ethics review in industry-funded projects. Just skimming the rest of this post. They're talking about concern over food ingredients. Yeah. So if you want to read that, that is from covington.com or cov.com. I just Google searched RFK executive order, and then you can read more about what he's got planned. But that part about like getting rid of psychiatric medications and like just different things that are supposed to help stabilize people with different personality or mood disorders or things like that. I have also seen where he wants wellness camps to wean people off of medications, specifically talking about like ADHD and being on stimulants like methamphetamines, not methamphetamines, amphetamines in general, but yeah, the like Adderalls and Ritalins and Vyvanse and things like that. He wants to put people in camps. I'm gonna just call it what it is. He says it himself. He wants to put them on farms, on camps, labor camps. They want to throw people into terrible living conditions, and they want to do eugenics. That's the point. That's the tweet. So let me see what y'all are saying in the chat. Do y'all know the song that goes "No Jews, no blacks, no gays"? It's kind of related, kind of not. Just curious. I don't know the song, but it's definitely related. Sounds like the Kennedys lobotomized Rosemary in 1941. Jesus, I want to say Saturn was in Aquarius just before that, so Saturn was probably in Pisces in 1941, actually. So scary. I'm currently listening to Fearing the Black Body, Racial Origins of Fat Phobia, and it feels so relevant on how anti-blackness and fat phobia are intertwined. Correct. Listening on Libby through my public library system. Yes, absolutely. That's a good source. So this is the title of that book again, if somebody wants to pause and write that down and go listen to it. Fat phobia is definitely included in the conversation. He wants wellness camps. I already said that. CDC pages on the flu vaccine are now gone. Yeah, there's a lot of CDC pages that are gone in general. He does have a very sketchy vaccine narratives that he's propagating. The other night, I was stressed because the California Department of Public Health website was offline when I was trying to find info about H5N1. Yes, that is intentional. Also, the removal of information as we've talked about before with Pisces, lying by omission. If you don't have evidence to support your claims, then you can't um, confirm or deny them. Back to the whole plausible deniability thing that we talked about earlier as well. Grifters are looking to liquidate social services, asked Memo. Yes, also that. And they're already doing that, as we've seen happen through various civil services that the Doge, which is Elmo Musk in them, Jay Bhattacharya as well, I believe. Is it Jay Bhattacharya? Because he's another guy in the whole thing that is very, very problematic. Hollowing out all of these social services to basically rob us blind. I mean, let's be honest. He's going to open the Jenny McCarthy Center for Wellness. Oh, God. And Jenny McCarthy is one of the people who says vaccines cause autism. So that's fun. Love to see that. So is the plan to remove the meds and let people go wild in order to justify carceral subjugation? Probably. Probably. Which is also why when people say, like, probably stop pathologizing things like narcissistic personality disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar, all of these different mood disorders and personality disorders, like, to stop pathologizing and stigmatizing them, because the minute that somebody, especially like with houseless people in public spaces or people who are addicted to certain substances, all of these different ways that you can demonize someone's mental health condition and, remove the things that are ideally keeping someone, functional more or less, to just be able to move about their day without being disabled by their state of mind. Like, the minute you take those stabilizers away and people start succumbing to their illnesses, or however, I'm trying not to speak. I'm trying to manage the way that I'm speaking about this, because I'm trying to be considerate, but it's like, yeah, the minute that people start behaving in a way that is socially unacceptable, to use the language of our Lord Jupiter and Taurus, then the easier it will be to stigmatize and then criminalize them, because all of these things are meant to stigmatize these identities so that they are easier to subjugate, basically. Yes. Especially throwing them in camps, like we've talked about Guantanamo Bay being reopened, and all of these things that we've talked about for trans people, and why they're trying to designate transness as a mental illness, and all of these different things. So it's like something that I've been thinking about. And then I have to go shortly after this, but something that I've been thinking about, especially with regard to like gender and things like that too, is how we've done this thing of saying, like, if children don't get to, if children lose access to gender affirming care, right? Like, that's been a big talking point. Then, we'll see a lot more child suicides, right? And it's like, I understand why people are saying that, I obviously relate to the conversation of transitioning and it being mental health care. I also don't like that conflation. And I also just don't like this idea of, like, speaking about things in this way that medicalizes it too far, because the institutions around mental health and wellness are corrupt, right? So it's like, people should be allowed autonomy over their bodies, period. For whatever reasons they need bodily autonomy, they should have it. I don't like when we have to bring these institutions into it, because these institutions don't have our best interests in mind. So it's tricky, like, when dealing with the state, it's tricky in the way that we talk about these things, and the ways that, if we keep telling people this is a mental health issue, then they're going to weaponize it against us and say, okay, well, then people who don't align with their assigned gender are mentally ill, and therefore we should throw them into the institution. They should be institutionalized, or things like that. It's like, that's where these things start to get kind of tricky. So just throwing that out there to say that, like, when you're making these arguments, maybe just be mindful of just be mindful of your advocacy for certain things, so that people are not weaponizing these things against the groups that they actually directly impact. Um, did I have anything else? I feel like I just said a lot. But yeah, all of this to say, the way that you speak about things matters. And the way that we talk about things influences culture. It can normalize certain behaviors and ideals and dispositions towards certain identities that we don't actually want to normalize. Don't normalize that shit. I don't care if you're making a joke and you're being funny, haha, it's not that serious. Right now, it is that serious. It is that serious. Mercury square Jupiter said it is that serious, babe. We don't want to normalize eugenicist talking points. We don't want to normalize racist talking points. We don't want to normalize ableist talking points. We don't want to normalize any of this shit. Okay, so be mindful of the ways that you are utilizing language in your everyday life and everyday conversations. And if you can interrupt somebody else's normalization of these constructs, do so. That's a form, I think, of silent activism or advocacy work that we really could benefit from the most, is just the ways that we engage with each other, the jokes that we make, the things that we laugh at. Like, really call that stuff in whenever it's happening in your everyday normal conversations, so that these attitudes aren't being proliferated further than they need to be. I think a lot of this will be especially important whenever Jupiter enters Gemini. And I'm starting to see a lot more how the mutable madness of 2025 is really this whole thing we're talking about with language and meaning, and the way that we use words and talk about things is shaping public consciousness. I definitely think that that is where we're at. So that's all I have to say for today. Share this video with a friend. If you haven't liked it already, please like the video. Subscribe if you haven't already. Join my channel. Tune in to more astrology and historical and political analysis, because I really enjoy doing it. It's like brain food to me. I'm like, oh my gosh, going down and finding these things out and learning the ways that they all connect, especially astrologically too, is just like, I'm just shook every single time. So I hope you enjoyed this video. And I will let you guys know if anything else comes up. I'm also doing a Patreon post for all of these Pisces transits. So I'm going to try to finish that up this week if I can. It's a big, long post. So if you are interested in that, subscribe to my Patreon. I will likely be making my Patreon free soon, unless you just want to donate because you want to donate. That's cool. I'll accept it. But I may be making my Patreon totally free soon, a free resource to all of you. So subscribe as a free member now, and then have access to all of my posts whenever I decide to release the items. So thank you so much for watching. If you are watching this later, thank you so much for tuning in. I will see you all next week. Have a wonderful Monday. Toodaloo. Cue outro music.